Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 241. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite chapters, social influence. Now normally this chapter has a lot of videos in it, which we will kind of push aside to the in portion section of the class, the synchronous section, but we're just going to kind of go over the basics here, and I will hopefully try to go through this as quick as possible and leave more stuff that isn't going to overlap with the asynchronous lecture for the synchronous lecture, given some of the comments that I had from you guys. So with that in mind, a couple quick announcements, right? If you do have any questions, feel free to stop by office hours or shoot me an email. And also remember, there is that final project that is due at the end of the semester. Now would be a good time to start just thinking about it a little bit, right? Probably don't need to get too far into it, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to at least start here. But where are we going in terms of social influence? Well, we'll talk about the basics, and then we'll talk about three specific types of social influence. First, we'll talk about conformity, then we'll talk about compliance, and finally, we will talk about obedience. But let's start out with the basics of social influence. What do we mean by social influence? Well, the way I like to think about it is, remember the definition of social psychology involves the presence or belief of presence of real, imagined, or implied other people. And when you think about why that matters, social influence is often the reason. What we mean by our definition of social influence is the presence of, or how the presence of other people influence our behavior, our feelings, and our thoughts. And more generally, we can just think about this as the collection of ways that people impact one another. So how is it that knowing there are people around affects the way you do things? One of the most impactful ways that this happens is through what we call social norms. These are learned cultural norms. And I ask people here, what are some classroom norms, which would be a lot easier if we were in person, so I've pumped it over to a VLQ. So what are some classroom norms that happen when classes are typically in person, and what are some classroom norms that might have switched due to this ongoing pandemic? So go ahead and answer that question, and we will jump in on the other side to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so social norms we know are these learned cultural rules, but we can describe those in one of two different ways. The first is what we call prescriptive. So in the same way that a doctor gives you a script for what you should be doing, these are the type of norms that describe how people should behave. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but living in Texas for 5 years taught me that Don't Mess with Texas is actually the state's campaign against littering. So Don't Mess with Texas means don't litter in Texas, quite honestly. But a prescriptive norm would be, right, you're not supposed to litter. Right? This is something that people just, right, kind of learn how to do, and it's a cultural rule. Now, do we always end up doing that? Not exactly. And that is what we call a descriptive norm, right? How people actually behave. Some people might know the prescriptive norm of littering is bad and you shouldn't litter, but some people might intend to abide by the descriptive norm of how we actually choose to behave, and well, maybe we look around and see if anybody's there and then decide to litter. So a second VLQ I like to ask you guys is, what happens when we break norms, right? When we are the ones to break a norm, not exactly littering, but say we do something that makes us look a little bit silly or look stupid in front of like random people. Right, say that you're walking down the path in front of a bunch of people and you realize you went the wrong way and now you have to turn around. That's breaking a norm in a way. How does it make you feel when that happens to you? And then how do you feel when other people break norms? And this is something I want to talk about a bit in class, so make sure your answer feels like something that you could bring up and answer in class as well. So go ahead and answer that, and then we will continue on. So what do social norms do? Why do we have these norms? And they're often unspoken rules too, right? Like, we know not to litter, but it's not like we had to be very much taught that. We know how to queue up in line, right? And stand one by one to get to wherever we need to go, or if we're going to pay at a cash register. Why do we know how to do this, and why do we use these? Well, norms help maintain social order, right? If you look here, there is nothing stopping you from driving right through here except a couple lines on the ground and a couple lines on a octagon over here. Why do we stop? Well, because it's part of our social, it's a norm that we have. It's actually codified as a law, and it's part of the way that it helps us to make the world work. Now, not only that, but these aren't always good, for instance, right? We know that certain people can order other people to do things, and that mindlessly following orders can become a problem. Also, when things break down, right, we see that people might lead to a diffusion of responsibility. These individuals might be de-individuated and maybe be more likely to break social norms. I talk about Adolf Eichmann here, who some of you might know, but Adolf Eichmann was somebody famous for what he called the Nuremberg defense. I believe we've talked about this, at least in some of my classes. The Nuremberg defense is this belief that it should be a defense. He was a high-ranking Nazi official, and he used his defense of, I was just following the orders that were given to me. I was just following orders. Now, we know that this is not a good defense, but right, when somebody tells us to do something, we often feel compelled to listen. And that is a piece of this social influence that we're talking about as well, and we'll discuss that later when we talk about things like compliance and obedience. But social influence, in general, can be summarized into one of three different types. Starting from the least strong type of social influence to the most strong up here, we can talk about first conformity. So conformity is doing as others do. So looking around, seeing what other people are doing and fitting into that category. You might change your behavior in response to some pressure from others, but they don't necessarily have to actually exert that in some kind of way. For instance, if you are going to be performing, right, as LeBron James looks to be doing here, I think that's LeBron James, in the Olympics, you have a strong pressure to conform to the group of doing really well. And that pressure is hopefully going to, in this case, make you play better, or at least play at the top of your game. Whereas, for instance, if you don't have that pressure, there maybe isn't a reason for you to try to play at the top of your game. Now, moving up this ladder of social influence, we might call it, we have compliance, or doing as others want. Now, the difference between compliance and conformity is we are asking somebody to do something with an explicit request. So actually asking somebody to do something. So whether that might be something like telling somebody to, right, just kind of signaling them, hey, take off your hat. It's not the Pledge of Allegiance. It's the national anthem. Excuse me. I don't go out anymore, and we don't go to sports events anymore. Right. So you can take off your hat. You can tell somebody, you can point to them, hey, hat off. You can walk up to somebody and be like, excuse me, could you please take your hat off? All of these are ways that somebody can comply with a request. And this is going to be a stronger version of social influence because it's actually requiring somebody to talk to us and tell us what to do. And oftentimes it's hard to say no to people like that. The final, though, type of social influence is obedience, or doing as others command. So this is a response to an explicit request. Just like compliance, the only difference between compliance and obedience is response to an authority figure, somebody in power. Now, I consider a sign that might say, like keep out government property, violators will be prosecuted. I would consider that a sign that you are supposed to obey. It's coming from an authority figure, right? Usually like the U.S. government or some kind of state government, but it's stronger than a compliance. It's coming from somebody with authority. Now, if I was standing outside of, my property and I said, hey man, or if I put up no trespassing signs, or I said, hey man, don't come in here, I would argue that is a compliance because you're changing behavior in response to an explicit request, but it's whether or not you have the authority to kind of give that request. However, I won't get too in the weeds with that. It should be pretty clear if I ask a question differentiating between those. Speaking of which, I have a VLQ for you here, right? Alan has 4 very close friends, all of whom smoke. Alan has never had a desire to smoke, and his friends have never asked him or told him to smoke. Nevertheless, he feels compelled to start smoking. The force that is pushing Alan to start smoking is known as what? So go ahead and answer that, and afterwards we will talk about it. All right, so hopefully you all have answered that question. Whether or not you have the right answer, I don't care for these VLQs. I just care that you do try them. And the correct answer is conformity. The reason it's conformity is, as mentioned up here, nobody has ever asked or told him to smoke. None of them are authority figures, so it has to be compliance. This is just a social pressure that Alan might be putting on himself due to what other people around him are doing. So speaking of conformity, let's dig into that a bit more. Conformity is this idea of changing one's behavior to match other people's responses or actions. Now, I don't know how many of you remember Crisscross, this band, but people used to wear their clothes backwards, or I guess Crisscross used to wear their clothes backwards, so people at the concerts would wear their clothes backwards. This is an interesting example, but it shows you, right, that nobody's making you do anything, but sometimes we just match what other people do. To give you an idea of how old this song is, it was the #1 song on the radio the day I was born, and I won't tell you when that was. Now, we can see this in other places. For instance, sporting events, right? At A&M, that's maroon is the major color there. You see how much maroon is in this kind of stance here. I would assume if I went to Stetson's baseball games, pre or post-COVID, I would see a lot of green. Additionally, we know, right, you don't have to necessarily know how to or be told to get in line. You just kind of know to queue up and you know how to wait. So one of the things that we can talk about with this is just the idea that conformity is more or less the lowest amount of social influence, and it's more just kind of looking around and going, what should I do in this situation to, right, fit in or conform with everyone else? One of the most interesting things about conformity is that it can actually be unconscious, what we call automatic mimicry. For instance, if you're somebody who is yawning or you see somebody who is yawning, you oftentimes will pass that on to another individual. So suggesting that these individuals are actually kind of looking at what you do and trying to mimic that as well, whether or not they're actually aware of this. Now, mimicry can also be conscious, of course, right? What you wear to class, right? How to board an airplane, things like this. But the interesting thing is that it can be unconscious too. So I actually used to work in a research lab focused on automatic mimicry. And what you see is that when a Confederate is sitting there and doing an action, right, rubbing their face or shaking their foot, individuals who are in that room are more likely to engage and do the same behavior as this other person. So, right, you see this as well, right? So looking at me for a second, right, I can sit here and rub my face like this for a second, and it's very likely that the person sitting next to me a couple feet might kind of catch on to that and start rubbing their face too. And the reason being is because we would think that individuals who are like us are going to do things like us, so mimicking us to seem like we are more similar. And we know that there is more mimicry that happens if the target is somebody that you like, if the person who you were trying to mimic, if you as the mimicker are high in this need to affiliate. We also know that this mimicry can increase if the target is somebody who isn't just liked but also attractive. And I don't necessarily mean physically attractive, but doing things we like, right? So if you find out that the person next to you kicked a puppy, you probably don't want to be like them, and you might actively try to avoid that. But if you find out the person next to you, right, saved an orphanage that was burning down, you probably want to be a little bit more like them and might increase your automatic mimicry. Now, as we mentioned, right, conformity can also be conscious in a lot of different ways, but it's really cool that there is an unconscious automatic component to this as well. Now, why do people conform? Well, we get a lot of benefits from it. And there's two major reasons that we can talk about as to why people conform. The first one is what we call informational social influence. Well, we are motivated by this desire to be accurate in our assumptions of people. And when we're not necessarily sure what's going on, we often look to other people to tell us what we should do. Right? So other people are useful sources of information about what is appropriate in a given situation, right? Maybe they know something I don't. So one great example of this is a an example my professor used one time in undergrad. And there was a very loud tornado alarm that went off. And it was close enough to the building that people inside could hear it. And everybody kind of stopped and looked at the professor in this 100-person classroom. And, there's a tornado watch going on. And I know the weather wasn't good that day. And she just kind of looked at everybody and said, "Why are you looking at me? We need to leave." And there was a tornado warning or a watch, whichever one. People had to go hide in the basement. But generally, the idea was that people didn't immediately go with what was right. They looked around to see, hey, what should we do? And I've got this great example that we'll talk about in class, the celebrity sighting video. But the reason behind informational social influence is we're trying to get information about what we should do. And other people give us good information. Say you've never been in a college classroom before and you have no idea what to do. If you come in a minute or two late and you see everybody sitting down waiting for the professor to show up, you probably are going to sit down and wait for the professor to show up. Makes it pretty easy to do. In class, what I usually do is I have somebody leave the room, and after, I tell them, hey, go get a drink down the hall. And I say, everybody else stand up. And so everybody stands up. Standing up for me isn't going to really do anything, but I make everybody take their notes standing up when the person walks back in. And what happens, no matter what, is this person will walk back in, they'll come back to their seat, they'll grab their stuff, and then they'll just stand up. And what's interesting is that it suggests, okay, so the professor must have said something while I was gone, so apparently we're all going to stand and not sit in our seats now. Okay, so this is one reason we do this, and one way we found that the informational social influence works is through Sharif's 1936 autokinetic effect study. So autokinetic meaning automatically moving, and what they did was they just had people look at this little dot, and they had participants first estimate this movement of this little dot in a dark room, on a blank wall. Let me show you a picture of that. So people would stand in a room and look at this for about a minute or two, and in the study, the light was supposedly moving. Now here, on a screen, you can pretty much tell it's not. But imagine being in a room alone and trying to measure how much this moved. So these individuals first estimated how much this moved alone, and then they viewed this in a group and estimated the movement with other people. And so what's interesting here is in our first study, we are getting in our first trial, viewing this alone, we're getting a measurement where individuals are giving what they see without any type of social influence, right? So for instance, participant 3 over here, thought that this moved, in about 7.5 inches, kind of left or right or up or down. Participant 1 thought it moved about an inch. Participant 2 thought it moved about 2 inches. So these people all have their different judgments. But now they do another trial, except they all work in the same room. They're all in the same room, and they all give their measurements at the same time, or one after another after another. And what do we see happen? Well, these numbers start to converge. Well, wait, why are we changing our answer? Well, because this is not an easy task, right? When you're asked, how many inches does this light move? And it's questions like this, less than an inch between 1 and 2, between 2 and 3, between 3 and 4. And you can't really tell. You're probably going to rely on whoever it was that you're talking to or listening to help you get some information. Well, I don't know, but this guy says it's only 2 or 3 inches. Maybe he's right because I'm not really sure myself. And that might make us more likely to change our answer. So this autokinetic study really does a good job of explaining this idea of this informational social influence, that we use other people as sources of information to figure out what the answer is or what we're supposed to do. For instance, a good example of this is, have you ever walked out of a test and you kind of look around and you go, did anybody else find that test to be difficult or easy or what? That is going to help you get some information about how everybody else did as well. And that's, I think, a good example of informational social influence. But when is it likely that we're actually going to do this? Well, we're not going to do this in too obvious situations when we know what to do, right? We're going to focus more on ambiguous situations, things that are, kind of more difficult or we're not sure of, often in times of crises, or if we need, some expertise that we don't have, right? So if, for instance, you weren't sure what to do and somebody got hurt, right? We would all turn and look towards a paramedic, probably more than ourselves, because that person should have expertise in that area. The importance of being accurate, right? Does it matter to you that you are accurate? Because sometimes if we're not accurate, we look like idiots and people laugh at us. And then additionally, there's this idea of, is this just something we're saying in public, right, that we're complying with in public, or is this something that we are accepting in private as well? So think about it. Is this going to be something that people are actually saying they believe because they need to say that, or are they saying they believe it because they believe it? Right? There's always some kind of questions with that, right? Somebody says, or for instance, I imagine, right, when somebody does something bad and has to make an apology, right, they often say, well, this isn't who I am. That's not, right, what I'm supposed to do. And it makes me wonder, are you just saying that in public to make yourself feel better, and privately you don't agree with it, or have you changed, and how can we tell? And this is that same kind of question with conformity. Are you saying it because you believe it, or are you saying it because it's what you're supposed to say? So that is another piece of the puzzle that we can talk about here. But what about, right, non-ambiguous situation, right? So things like driving. Not very ambiguous. You know how to continue down the road, following the person in front of you, right? Standing in line or waiting to get your coffee. You know how to do these things. Excuse me while I itch my leg, right? So would you find conformity in a clear situation? Oh yeah, all the time, right? Think about it. People know when to clap, right? People know when to laugh during these things. This is called normative social influence. These are the norms. We know what to do. And oftentimes these happen because we want to be liked. We gain rewards when we are part of the group. We avoid punishments when we're part of the group. We follow norms because it helps to keep us as part of the group. People who don't follow norms are often seen as outcasts or strange, depending on why they don't follow the norms. And so recognizing that as a very good reason to be part of a group. Right? We're motivated by a desire to be accepted. If we have our social needs met, it's more likely we're going to survive, pass on our genes to the next generation, and have a better life. We know that conformity is generally based on a desire to fulfill others' expectations. Those social norms are often expectations for us. We know when we're supposed to take our hat off when we walk into a certain building. At A&M, for instance, the student center was dedicated to, as it was a former military school, was dedicated to any Aggie, as they called him, past, present, or future, who had given their life for their country. As such, you weren't allowed to wear a hat on inside. So people knew to take their hats off as walking inside because it's a respectful thing. Now, right, you don't have to follow that, but you're probably going to, get punished for that, being yelled at or smirked at, or I shouldn't say smirked, but kind of scowled at. And peer pressure is a very, very valuable tool in our tool set to get people to do what we want. Now, when we talk about when this normative influence happens, though, we can talk about Ch9's 3 factors in his social impact theory. So what are the 3 factors that help to make normative influence happen, that help to make this influence about why we do these things, right, to kind of play the game? Well, 3 factors matter when we will do this. 1, strength. How important is the group? Now, is this a group of people you just met who you're never going to see again, right? People in an elevator? Or are these your colleagues? Are these, right, your classmates? Are these people who you spend a lot of time with, right? Churchgoers, right? People who go to the same church as you or go to, right, the same, soup kitchen if you work at that, something like that. How important is the group? Well, if it's super important, you're probably going to follow the norms of that group. The immediacy. How close in time and space are we to the issue? So if this is an immediate thing, maybe it's more likely that we are going to conform. right? You often hear this. I think I'd like an example would be when you hear people say things like, yeah, well, if I was there, I would have beat him up. It's like, okay, so you say that now, but you're not in the situation. When you have that kind of distance from the situation, you might be able to think more clearly about what to do. But social norms are really, really strong. When somebody tells you to do something or you're asked to do something, you often just do it without thinking about it, right? Because we want to be liked. And lastly, the last part of this is the number. How big is the group? And the most interesting thing about this is it only matters about 4 group members, right? Any more than 4 other group members, so like 5 total people, there's really nothing better than that. So you can have a group of 100 or you can have a group of 10 people, and you're probably going to get the same level of social impact regarding the number of people rather than getting a more increased response in front of 1,000 people rather than 10 or 100. So there's also this idea of descriptive and prescriptive norms. Both of these play a role, right? If the group you're in, right, for instance, if you want to be the cool kid in high school who smokes cigarettes with the cool kids, right, that is going to be a descriptive norm, right, from that group. It's not going to be a prescriptive norm. The prescriptive norm is that you're not supposed to smoke. We can also talk about this. Is this just informational or is this normative social influence? It's probably both. And there's a lot of things that involve, right, why it might be more than just one or the other. So recognizing that, I think, is something very important that you should be able to do as well, is be able to look at a situation and say, is this more informational? Is this more normative? Is this a little of both? Which one is it? And so being able to do that, I think, is a really useful skill to see why people do what they do. Now, the last couple things to mention with conformity is the importance of things like cohesion. Having a group, right, that is cohesive or kind of all together and seen as a tighter knit unit than a kind of loose gathering of people leads to more conformity. So people you are closer to, people you are more cohesive with, you get more conformity. Higher status tends to lead to more conformity. However, disapproval hurts more from a higher status person, right? Because that is seen as more normative. We can talk about things like public response, public commitment, and group size, unanimity, and culture all matter. But generally, the reason I put all of these up is not to go through them one by one, but recognizing that all of these things matter for if we're going to conform to another person or not. It's not just those 3 factors, though those are incredibly important. Overall, I think what you should know here is just that these are other factors that do matter in terms of conformity. And you can imagine why any one of these might specifically matter. The interesting thing to mention here, though, with public response and public commitment, right, this is the idea of saying something out loud or publicly committing to doing something, which is going to put pressure on you because now you're kind of on the hook for it. Now, over and above everything else, unsurprisingly, interdependent cultures more than independent cultures tend to focus more on conformity, but with everything we've talked about regarding different types of cultures, this isn't really too surprising. But if you do have any questions about those, I'd love to chat about why these are and come up with some examples as well. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. This is just kind of a summary for conformity. Why do we conform? Well, those around us influence us. And sometimes when we're influenced by a desire to be accurate. And so we follow this informational social influence. Sometimes we're motivated by this desire to be liked, in which case we will follow this normative social influence. So between these two, these are often a good way to understand or think, why would somebody do that, right, when they are asked to, especially if they don't, right, if they know they shouldn't. Or I guess I shouldn't say asked to, because that is where we're going with compliance. So doing as others want. And compliance is changing one's behavior in response to a direct request, right? Eat more chicken is going to be a compliance request, However, this isn't going to be something that somebody's going to say to you, but it is something that a corporation, right, might put this. And as we mentioned before, we might have public compliance, right? We might yield to a request for a behavior or agreeing to a point of view while privately disagreeing. So, for instance, I think about people who might hand me flyers as I walk by. I really don't want to take them. They're like, here, would you like a flyer? And I'm like, no, thank you. They're like, take one. No, go ahead. And I just kind of take it because I'm very agreeable, and I don't want to bother them. I just want to keep going, right? And so while I don't necessarily comply with whatever it is they're giving me, or do I agree it, but I will take it because, right, it's just the easier and the more socially acceptable thing to do. Now, with this, with compliance, two ways that we often have people help us comply, and if you're ever looking to figure out how to do some kind of, I don't want to say manipulation, but some good strategies for getting what you want. Two of those are the door in the face technique and the foot in the door technique. But let's start with the door in the face technique. So if you are, and this is often thought about as a traveling salesman type deal. So if you're a traveling salesman, say you're going around trying to sell vacuum cleaners door to door, you walk up to a door and somebody, right, and you ask somebody, hi there, would you like to buy a vacuum cleaner? They're going to be like, no, and they're going to shut the door in your face, slam the door in your face, door in the face. So what you do is then you knock on that door again and you ask, I'm sorry, it seems like we got off on the wrong foot. Could I come in and take 5 minutes of your time to just demonstrate this vacuum cleaner? And the idea is we ask for this large favor first, right? Do you want to buy a vacuum cleaner? And then we retreat to a small favor and work our way back up. So the way I like to think about this is, say you want a piece of pie, right? Right. And you first ask for the whole pie. You say, hey, can I eat the whole pie? And they go, absolutely not. That's for everybody. You can't eat a whole pie. Watch me. But what you say is, fine, you're right. Can I have like 2 slices of pie then? Well, fine, that's a lot better than a whole pie, so go ahead and do that. So the door in the face technique is asking for a big favor first and getting the door more or less slammed on your face, and then asking for a smaller favor. On the other hand, we have the foot in the door technique, right? So as the door is kind of shutting, you slide your foot in there to stop it. Go, wait, 1 second, right? So foot in the door technique is a small request followed by gradually larger requests. So maybe instead you say, hi, ma'am, could I come in and take a few minutes of your time just to demonstrate this vacuum cleaner? Okay, great. And now that I've taken a few minutes of your time, could I actually clean this whole room, which is going to take me 10 minutes to just show you how good this is? Great. Now, why don't I give you my card and, hey, is your husband going to be home soon? Going with the standard 50s style selling here. They actually did this to my parents for a, what would you call that? A water purifier system is actually how they did that, more or less. But right, eventually working that person up to buying the vacuum cleaner. And so the idea might be first, right, if you want, right, half the pie, you might first say, can I get a slice of pie? Sure, you can have a slice of pie. How about another slice of pie? Okay. How about another slice of pie? What you're doing is you're starting with just enough to eke your foot in the door and then growing upon that. Right. So I have a couple videos for some of these examples, which apologies. I just don't want to get copyright striked again. Thanks, YouTube. COVID. Gotta love it. But so with the door in the face technique, one study looking at this by Caldini and colleagues was a juvenile counseling study. I love this because this is such an interesting study and it tells you how nice people are towards juvenile delinquents. So Caldini asked individuals, hey, would it be possible for you to supervise a juvenile trip, a trip for juvenile delinquents to the zoo? It's going to take about 2 hours to do that. What do you think people said? I would love to, but I just can't make it. So, I'm sorry. Well, okay, fine. No worries. So the other version of the study, they asked people, hey, would you be willing to counsel juvenile delinquents every week for 2 years? What, 2 years? I don't know. That's a really long time. How am I going to fine. That's okay. How about this? Instead of 2 years of counseling, would you be able to just, come with us on a 2-hour trip to the zoo next week? That's all. You don't got to do the 2 years, just a 2-hour trip on the zoo. Okay. Well, so what did we see the difference here? Well, in our first condition, right, just asking, not using the door in the face technique, 17% agreed to help go to the zoo. Now, how about this condition where we do the door in the face? We ask for a huge request first, then we say, okay, we understand you can't do that. How about a small request? 50% agreed to help. We went from less than 1 in 5 to 1 in 2 were willing to help. This works a lot. It's almost scary to teach on because this can be a really effective tool if you know how to use it correctly. Why does this work? Well, one of the reasons that this works is what we call the norm of reciprocity. We have expectations that when somebody needs help, and we help them, that they will help us as well. If I scratch your back, you'll scratch mine. Or we might meet someone halfway. Now, there's a lot of ways that this norm of reciprocity works, actually. For instance, saying thank you, saying hello. So for those of you who are waiters or waitresses, what we see is that actually smiling at this person or saying thank you, or just being kind actually leads people to like you more because of this norm of reciprocity. Well, you're nice to me, so I'm going to try to be nice to you as well. And individuals who do these kind of things can actually get bigger tips. Waitresses and waiters, that is. Now, with the foot in the door technique, we kind of just talked about this already, right? Using a smaller ask to ask for more and more and more, and eventually getting bigger and bigger. So this is a Friedman and Fraser study, and what they did was they just asked people, will you display this large sign in your yard? And this is one of these, it wasn't a political sign. I forget necessarily what the sign was, but they asked people just to display this large sign in their yard first. Or they asked people, will you display this small sign in your window first before coming back and saying, now will you display this large sign in your yard? And interestingly enough, again, 17% agreed in the without the door in the face, or excuse me, without the foot in the door technique. They just offered to, right, say, okay, you can put the sign up. Now, in the other condition here, right, where we start with a small request first and then ask a bigger request, we get up to 76%. That's incredible. And why does this work? Well, this one is more about dissonance. We want to stay consistent. I've said yes to one thing for you already. Why should I maybe say no? If you see yourself as an agreeable person committed to helping, right, to say no would trigger this dissonance. And you've already done something for this already, right? Almost like an in for a penny, in for a pound, as they say, right? Well, I'm already done this much. Why not keep going? So the question I have for you guys then is just, what might be some useful places to use a door in the face technique for you? And how about a foot in the door technique? So think of like an example each and tell me why. And we can go ahead and move on from there. So another reason we might actually comply with things is this idea of negative state relief. Right, so people engage in certain actions, such as, right, agreeing to a request, relieve their negative feelings, and feel better about themselves. And we are more likely to conform if conforming will decrease our negative affect, especially when we're guilty. So what does this really look like? Well, we observe something happen. Doesn't necessarily have to be an emergency, but we observe some kind of issue, and we might feel guilty either from before the event or because of the event, and that might make us more likely to provide help because we want to get rid of that guilty feeling. So, for instance, say that you... that's an extreme example. Well, we'll just go with it. Say that you, right, just got caught, right, cheating on a test, and you feel really terrible and you feel really bad about that. And you walk outside and you see somebody, right, maybe actually begging for money. You might be, you're actually more likely to donate money, or just generally be like a better person towards this, towards an individual after feeling guilty, because this is one way to get rid of that negative affect. And it can help you reduce that negative feeling. Now, sometimes we can just reduce that negative feeling based on doing what we need to, that conformity, compliance, but that's not the only way that we can do this. So that is wrapping up compliance, but let's move on to obedience. And obedience is changing behavior in response to a demand from an authority figure. So, the questions I ask here: would a nurse inject a patient with a lethal dose of medicine if a doctor ordered it? Yes, and it has happened. Will directions from an authority figure lead a person to behave in ways that they would never do normally? Yes, that we know that to be true. And the last question, would ordinary men administer lethal shocks to an innocent victim after an experimenter's orders? And you couldn't guess what study this is. This is Milgram's obedience study. So obedience is its own type of social influence. It's the strongest type of social influence. And this is the response to an authority figure's demand. And what we mean by that is when somebody with an authority over you tells you to do something, are you going to do it? Now, we hear, people supposedly standing up to incorrect authorities or people who are, abusing their authority. But it is not easy. And to demonstrate that, before we can even talk about, what has been going on in the world around us, I think it's really useful to talk about obedience and see what, how strong really is this influence. And Milgram's study was the effects of punishment on memory. And he had individuals that he recruited from the town population with a newspaper ad come in to help study the effects of punishment on memory, and you'll get paid for your time. This was a word pair memorization task where a machine had between 15 and 450 volts. And the teacher delivered painful electric shocks to the learner for incorrect answers. So the learner, who was actually a Confederate, who was in on the experiment, was in their own room, put away to the side. They were actually a middle-aged man with a heart condition. And here's some pictures from this. Here's our learner here. The teacher is right here, who is going to be the actual participant in the experiment. And the experimenter is over here. And so the teacher, the actual person who is taking part of the experiment, actually watches and kind of helps the learner get put into this shock device. And this is in order to make this seem a little bit more legit. Now, in fact, this was unplugged before the experiment even started. The Confederate was not hurt at all. And what they did was they used a pre-recorded tape after certain voltages to mimic how loud or upset the experimenter was. So the more interesting thing is this box up here. This box up here is Milgram's original shock box, more or less. Now, actually, if you are ever in the psychology department on the third floor, there's a case full of some really interesting old school technology from psychology. But next to that is a picture. And in that picture, one of our faculty members has a picture next to this box, the original Milgram experiment box that has been infamous since then. Something very interesting if you are ever walking by and want to see something cool. So how did this box work? Well, there's a bunch of little levers on here, and once you hit them, a shock goes off for a couple seconds. So at the beginning, we have things like a slight shock, a moderate shock, a strong shock, a very strong shock, an intense shock, extreme shock, danger, followed by XXX. How it is set up is that every time the person fails, you give them the next highest voltage. So currently, not sure how well you can see, all of these levers through strong shock over here have been pulled down, where the next time the participant gets it wrong, the very strong shock right here will be pressed down in order to deliver that shock. Now, with this, the experimenter was, the the learner, the Confederate, was unconnected from the actual shock, but was playing or had played a noise or some kind of recording for them. So at 15 volts, right, they just kind of made I don't like this. At a higher level of voltage, right, hey, this really hurts, right? That's all. Oops, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart is starting to bother me. Get me out of here. Please let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out. After this shock, silence. When there's silence, the experimenter says, treat no response as the wrong response and deliver the next highest level of shock. Now, I have a video, but due to copyright issues, I will not be playing it for us. But what I want to know, hopefully you didn't see that. If you did, ignore it. So this VLQ here, compared to the predicted value, the actual percentage of obedient participants was higher, lower, or about the same. This green line here is what Milgram predicted, how many percent would be obedient, right? And so by the intensity level of 30, XXX, he believed that pretty much no one would be obedient. So go ahead and answer that if you think it'd be higher, lower, or about the same. Well, given the fact that you were in social psychology, you hopefully know a little about the Milgram experiment, and the actual percentages were a lot higher. Over 75% of people, or excuse me, I guess 65% of people went to the end. Closer to 3/4 of people went past where this person stopped talking and was more or less assumed to be dead. That's really, really scary. Right? Just being told that somebody in a white lab coat, right? This person is an authority figure, but what are they going to do? Shoot you if you walk out? The door was right there. The experimenter wasn't stopping people, but why did this happen? Because that's how impactful obedience is. So here, right, we had all obey, all are still obeying, all are still obeying, and still to hear. It wasn't until we hit this intense shock that 1 in 4 stopped. And then after that, 1 in 8 more would stop about here. But pretty much until the end, still. Well, what about the difference between today and 1961? Well, they did a slightly more ethical version of this in 2009. No real difference. The study stopped at 150 volts, where the learner asked to be released. Everybody was pre-screened by a clinical psychologist, and actually 36% of people were excluded just in order to not have any negative psychological damage to them. They were told explicitly that they themselves and the learner could leave. And this was a more diverse, more educated sample. The original sample only included men, but this sample included men and women. But otherwise, it was identical. They used the same prods, you must continue. They used the same newspaper-style recruitment. 70% went to 150 volts and were ready to continue. 82% in Milgram's original experiment were ready to continue at that point. That's not a statistically significant difference, and gender didn't matter either. This is crazy. This is wild that this happens, and it's something that really blows my mind. And it's something we all fall into so easy. And we ought to spend some time talking about why we fall into this so easy when we do talk about this in class. And I would encourage you to have some kind of answer to that question for me. But beyond that, I'm not going to go through each one of these because there's a heck of a lot of them, but let's see some variants of the Milgram experiment that people have done over the years. And the bottom line down here is the percentage of people who actually agreed. You've got your kind of rate E's for experimenter, S is for subject, the person giving the shocks, V is for the victim receiving the shocks, and here's just some different kind of variations on the Milgram experiment. So right in the classic version, we still had over 63% of people be completely obedient until the very end. But when the subject is a bystander and the experimenter gives the orders to another subject, the subject who is watching is more likely to stay there even longer. When there are two other subjects following orders, we can think of this more like normative or social influence as well playing a role, because people see other people standing around doing the same thing, so they think, yeah, I ought to do that too. The subject being a bystander and the other subject is giving shocks, that is going to be important as well. We can see this goes all the way down the line, except there's a couple down here towards the bottom that we see very little shocks. So down here, right, if two other people giving shocks say, no, I'm not going to continue, you're much more likely yourself to say, I agree, I'm not going to continue. If the experimenter says to stop at 150 volts, but the victim says to go on, very few people will still continue to shock the victim. But this victim seems very strange for wanting to get more shocks. When the experimenter is the learner, and the ordinary person gives orders, right? So say that I was running this experiment, and then I would bring two people into the lab to operate as, let me go back and pause this real fast. The idea with that would be that both of these people are actually subjects, and the person running the experiment is considered the learner over here. So as we go back, let me pause that. People are less likely to follow somebody who's not an actual authority person. If the experimenter disagrees and says, no, we shouldn't do this, nobody does it. One thing to mention that I think is really interesting is that one way we can decrease this a lot is if the experimenter has the subject help them. If the experimenter actually forces the subject to touch a prod to something, to physically touch it, to the person's skin or to like some connection that will go to the person, we see a huge decrease. And this reminds me of when we in class discussed the trolley problem, right? Is it okay to push a fat man to stop the trolley versus pull a lever? And many people said that it's more okay to pull a lever than it is to push, this very fat man, as they called him in that clip. But this reminds me of this idea of touch, because it's harder to do something when we have to do it physically, right? This idea of construal level comes into play versus when we are alone. So you don't need to memorize this whole chart, but do recognize what is it that's causing people to not be as obedient here. And that is what you want to know. So why does this happen? Well, one of the most important things that we can talk about here is the informational and normative social influence, right? We see the person giving us directions as the person who knows what to do, right? We are using our informational influence from them. And additionally, we have a normative influence to be liked by these individuals too. We just assume this is what we're supposed to be doing and they know best for us. Why did this happen? There wasn't a lot of personal responsibility. Right? The experimenter is the one taking the personal responsibility. You're the one shocking the person and possibly killing them, but it's the experimenter who is responsible for this. Doesn't that sound a lot like I was just following orders? Because that does to me, and that suggests that maybe this is a problem. Self-justification, right? This idea that, well, it's not me doing this, I'm being told to do this. And then this gradual increase. This is a foot in the door. If we started at the highest voltage, no, I'm not going to start at the highest voltage. That looks like he's going to kill somebody. But if you start me at the lowest voltage, I might be able to work my way up here. Now, we know some of the factors that decrease experience. If the status or the prestige of the experimenter is low, people are more likely to disobey. If others disobey, as we mentioned, more people are likely to disobey. Proximity to the victim. So do you have to physically do this to the victim? Is the victim in the room? Things like this matter. And then personality characteristics. We do know there are some personality characteristics that might affect who is going to actually continue onward. So with that in mind, the last couple things to mention here are this idea that obedience and its characteristics that led to this. Part of this is that there's some kind of distance to the victim, whether that be emotional, whether that be physical, and especially both. You're less likely to actually engage in this kind of behavior if that issue is right in front of you. Right? If you can't hear the learner and you have to shock by remote, there's nearly 100% obedience, because there's really no different right at that point than just pressing a button, because you don't really know what's happening on the other side. We also know institutional authority matters. So Bridgeport, Connecticut was a couple miles down the road, and this wasn't being done, right, sanctioned by Yale, right, where Milgram originally worked. So Yale, being this very strong, powerful institution, is seen as more legit, right? So when you're just somebody in Bridgeport, Connecticut, you don't have the credentials to be able to get away with this. And then, as we mentioned before, this presence of resistors. So 2 defiant teachers are added, only 10% obey. Most of the people will walk away, given that probably the normative influence has changed a bit. Okay, well, hopefully this is a good opener to what we'll be talking about with social influence. So we'll talk more about that during our normal days in class. But if you do have any questions with anything, feel free to shoot me an email. Stop by office hours, whatever. Other than that, make sure you're thinking about that final project. And until then, I will see you all later. Have a great day. Bye-bye.